I'm Phil Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
And it's time for another installment of Archaeology of Connecticut, and we are thrilled to have Dr. Brian Jones here with us. He is our state archaeologist. If you didn't know we had one, we have one, and we're so happy to have one. So today we're going to learn all kinds of things, and Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce your guests.
Okay, thanks, LRB. Today we've got... Let's see. We've got Scott Brady, of course, and I'll let him say hi in a second. But first, I want to get around to Dan Forrest, who is a repeat visitor on the show. We talked with Dan last month about the early Archaic period, and we're going to have Cosimo Sgarlata. So let me just start with Dan again, just to get to remind the audience a little bit about yourself, and then Cosimo, when Dan's done, are you out there, Cos?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, excellent. And hopefully you're turned up loud enough so the audience can hear you well. Dan, let's just start with you. Tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dan Forrest. I'm a lifelong Connecticut resident. Done quite a bit of archaeology in Connecticut and other southern New England states. I'm a former state historic preservation officer here in Connecticut and currently work for the Public Archaeology Laboratory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
Great. And Cos?
Hi, I'm Cosimo Sgarlata. I'm a professor at Western Connecticut State University, and I'm president of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut. And I'm very interested in talking today on the program about the Archaic.
Excellent. And Scott?
Hi, Brian. How are you today?
Great.
Hey, one of the things that some people have reached out to me regarding the show, and they're not necessarily trained in archaeology. They don't necessarily have a degree or have taken upper-level classes. And one of the things they were curious about or concerned about is whether they were getting some of what was being said here. And as the only person at the table here who doesn't hold an advanced degree in archaeology, I can kind of understand where they're coming from. So if I could I take a minute and kind of paraphrase what we've talked about the last couple shows and see if you guys agree with that?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So we started in the Paleo period, which is after the ice has receded away from Connecticut. And it's more of a tundra-like area. The idea is that they are surviving on these large caribou herds that are roaming the plains or the tundra, at least partially. And they're moving large distances following this food source, at least for part of the year. From there, we transitioned kind of to the Archaic, the early Archaic period, where we're starting to see a change in the weather. So the weather's changed. The forests are a little different. We don't think there's as much opportunity to pursue those large game animals. So maybe now we're going to a deer-based or smaller game diet. And we have several different cultures or traditions on the landscape at the same time is the thought. Mm-hmm. And we kind of identify those traditions by the types of stone they're using to make their tools and the shapes of those tools that they're making.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of anchor that with radiocarbon dates whenever we can get them. Obviously we can fill that out a lot more, but if folks want to listen to the prior shows, they're going to kind of get a lot of the details on that. But I thought this is a chance right now to briefly kind of remind ourselves where we left off with the early Archaic last time. And I think we talked about some ideas of the importance of wetlands in the subsistence system, especially to the Gulf of Maine Archaic tradition peoples. Who are the ones who are not. They don't appear to be making projectile points very often. They're somehow maybe focused on trapping or otherwise hunting games, and maybe using these little insets into tools to make their projectiles out of rather than chipping them out of stone as a solid piece. And that changes then when we see the bifurcate tradition come into our area probably around 8,500 radiocarbon years ago at the very end of the early Archaic. And with that, I think we're seeing a change to a somewhat more modern oak-based forest. There's probably an increase in the deer population. There probably had been some deer around. And so we see a shift from focus on the wetlands with some pretty substantial residential sites at times showing up in certain places in New England to the presence of really kind of smaller, more scattered sites that seem focused more on sort of short-term hunting camps. Dan, would you add anything to that?
I think that I would agree with that general characterization. I think we can see as we're moving from the early Archaic to the Middle Archaic, there are a couple of other pieces that really become important to the people who are living in this general region. One of those is fishing. Certainly major rivers, large lakes are an area of focus for people to settle. That does contrast with that sort of wetland-focused economy that was in place for certain people who were living just a few hundred years earlier in the region.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what is fascinating in a way is that throughout this discussion, and we'll hope to pursue this as we get into the periods that follow, we're seeing these gradual changes in what archaeology would call the subsistence base. That is sort of what people are focused on to live day to day. What they're hunting, what they're gathering, the food types that they're taking advantage of that are available to them in their environment, and changes in how broadly they move around the landscape to take advantage of different habitats and resources at different times of the year, and often constraints on that movement because of population density changes. So let me kind of jump in by saying, as we jump into the Middle Archaic period, what I have personally seen in the archaeological record of primarily eastern Connecticut, where I've excavated, is a very strong focus on what I would call regional stone raw material sources like quartzite. So there's a big band of quartzite, which is a tough stone. Most people are probably familiar with the white, shiny quartz as a rock, but quartzite's a little bit more sugary, but a metamorphosed stone, if I'm right there, Dan, right? It's a metamorphic stone. Okay. It's actually an excellent stone for making tools out of. It's not as good as the material we referred to earlier as chert that you mostly get, say, in our region, in the New York State area. But it worked quite well for them, and we see people apparently starting to use the same quarries again and again in eastern Connecticut. And I'm not sure exactly what they're doing in western Connecticut. Kaz, do you know for the Middle Archaic what your points are generally made out of from your side of the world?
Well, from the central Connecticut Valley, from the New Haven area, they're using the local hornfels, which is derived from the magma flows, from the contact with the magma flows in sandstone. So it's a local material, very local material. Yeah.
So we get a sense that people are kind of starting to focus in on a smaller region. We're not seeing rock moving across the landscape in kind of a large-scale way. There's a little bit of movement of some of the rhyolites from the Boston area coming into Connecticut, but not so much. So Dan, do you want to talk about implications of that?
So those distribution patterns for where those different types of stone show up, what we see people using, it does reflect an interesting balance where there's clearly a lot of interaction going on between various groups who are living in the area. Because you can see that in the way all of the stone tools share a very common type. They share the same form, and they're often made in very similar ways. And that pattern extends all the way down to the southeast and, a fair bit north of Connecticut as well. So there's this very large region of the East Coast where people seem to be following a generally similar pattern. But that focus on local resources does suggest that even though there's a lot of interaction, people are spending a lot more time in more constricted territories or more constricted aspects of the landscape.
So maybe we could even say they're starting to associate themselves with particular homelands or something like that, if we want to kind of put it in a human mindset, perhaps. And it is an interesting, weird kind of dichotomy there, where on the one hand, you've got a very broad cultural tradition that spans almost all the way to Florida and up to Nova Scotia that we're part of here in the middle, in southern New England. And yet, all across those areas, people are using their local stone. So somehow communication is happening to keep the tradition similar across such a huge space, which we don't see happen as much at later times. It kind of comes and goes as kind of broad traditions, but they're kind of focused on their own regions, and I think that's pretty important to think about. So, Kaz, how much experience do you have with Middle Archaic sites in the western part of the state? Because in some ways, I kind of feel like they're a little less common than they are in eastern Connecticut.
Hey, Kaz. Before you answer that question,
yep.
Can you speak up a little bit better? And I think during the commercial, I'm going to have you call our studio line. We are having a hard time hearing you. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Basically, not too much in western Connecticut. Pretty much what I know from research is central Connecticut, where they do appear, but a lot of them are isolated points instead of, in context of a lot of other stuff.
Okay, and I would say the camps that we've excavated in eastern Connecticut tend to be, on the smaller side. Many of them are associated with a lot of tool production, so you can have thousands of flakes associated with it, and spent tools, spent projectile points, and scraping tools. But they do suggest sort of temporary encampments. However, kind of repeated use of certain landscapes. And again, we see this sometimes around the peripheries of wetlands or maybe lakes, as Dan was talking about. Would you add anything to that, Dan, from what you've seen?
So I think to help people get an understanding of why the Middle Archaic really stands out in this region, for all of the people who are associated with the periods we've talked about previously, the Paleo-Indian and the early Archaic, sites associated with those people's lives are very rare. There's a fair number of them that have been identified at this point, but in real terms, they're quite rare. People may spend their entire careers trying to find them and never be successful. Middle Archaic is the first period where, if not common, they're not uncommon. And if you think about this, I think for most archaeologists in the region, if you said, how long do you think it would take you to find a Middle Archaic site if you had 10 people and unlimited access to the landscape to do testing? Most people would be fairly confident they could find a Middle Archaic site in a reasonable period of time, whereas I don't think many would say the same thing for early Archaic or Paleo-Indian.
Yeah, exactly.
So there seems to be a pretty significant increase in population in this area, and that's probably ultimately underwritten by those changes in the environment. It's more amenable to people. It's a friendlier environment in a lot of respects, and that's not necessarily a wonderland, but relative to several centuries earlier, there's a lot greater variety of foodstuffs available, and they're available in a much larger percentage of the landscapes in which people are living.
Right. And as a general rule, I think most archaeologists would agree that it's during the Middle Archaic that we really see deer enter into the subsistence space in a big way. And so we're essentially dealing with people living in a fairly modern environment like the one we understand around us today.
Do all the sites kind of have the same characteristics? Are they all, or are there specific camps versus villages versus fishing places, or?
So there are some if we're not talking specifically about Connecticut, but southern New England, let's say, there are a number of locations, and some of these are around large lakes or swamps where there's a lot of evidence people returned, probably fairly large numbers of people returned for extended periods of time. And so there are large numbers of hearths, there are a large number of pit features. Some of them are still enigmatic. Archaeologists are still arguing over how to interpret some of those. But this is also the first period where we start seeing real mortuary patterns, although they're rare. They show interconnections between, Connecticut and quite far-flung areas, both to the north and the south of us, again, reflecting that kind of interaction.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, sites, the probably most significant one in our region is Anasnappet Pond, that our colleague Diana Doucette has spent a lot of time working on, did her dissertation largely on that site, and had a very elaborate mortuary location there set up. And it's important to think, we, as archaeologists, we do not really want to be digging into native burials. That sort of goes without saying, or it should now. But during some construction projects, that can happen, and then that situation needs to be very carefully managed. And in this case, this one particular burial had a very large atlatl weight, like a big wing-shaped bannered stone, right? Is that and a couple of spear points that seemed to be lined up, suggesting someone had been placed in the ground with a number of spears and this large spear-throwing device with a big, elaborate weighted stone on it, but beautifully ground and polished.
And so, Scott, to get back to your question, there are these exceptional sites, and I think Diana Doucette, if she's listening, would agree. Anasnappet is a truly exceptional Middle Archaic site. It's a truly exceptional site, no matter what period it's associated with. The most common types are what Cos was mentioning earlier, which is that we find projectile points, particularly what we call Neville's or Stanley's, and somewhat later Stark's. Those points show up frequently on sites that were used repeatedly throughout the Archaic period. And in some cases, we're lucky enough to be able to find materials that we can confidently associate with those, and so we get a more detailed picture of what people were doing in these specific locations. But often it's fairly limited. We'll get a small number of stone tools, a few that we can confidently say were used by people during this period, but not an awful lot more than that.
Hey, gentlemen, let's go to commercial for a minute and thank our merchant partners. And Kaz, can you call us on our studio line?
Sure.
Do you have the number, or should I give it to you?
If you could give it to me real quick.
All right. It's 860-526-4278.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, gentlemen, we'll just do that for a minute.
Yeah,
sure.
And
Get it
there
done
we
with.
go.
Good.
Serve on board a World War II submarine? What life was like for the submariners who dedicated their service to America under the waves? Come see and experience it all at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut. Enter the first nuclear submarine America made, the USS Nautilus, and see where these brave men served. See where they slept, worked, ate, and lived together for seemingly endless time underwater. Look through the periscope of the past and find everything you wanted to know about submarines in the museum's vast collection of artifacts and documents. Go to ussnautilus.org for information on new exhibits, special events, and educational opportunities, or to schedule a group tour. The best part about the Submarine Force Museum is that it's completely free. Bring the family and explore the wonders of submarine life and learn the history of America's storied past of life beneath the waves. The Submarine Force Museum, Crystal Lake Road, Groton, and online at ussnautilus.org. And remember, it's free.
Come to Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut to experience art and culture in a magnificent historic setting. A visit to Hillstead Museum unlocks a 1901 architectural treasure. French Impressionist paintings, Ming Dynasty Chinese porcelain, Japanese woodblock prints and period furnishings. Enjoy a guided tour with interpreters who have the inside scoop on the family that created this landmark. Take time to experience the tranquility of Hillstead's sunken garden, or take in surrounding vistas of the Litchfield Hills while sitting on the Mount Vernon-inspired veranda. There is something for everyone at Hillstead in Farmington. Bring your friends and family to one of our many public programs, such as the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival, May Market, Heyday, or Holiday Boutique. Find a complete schedule of events at hillstead.org. Visit Hillstead Museum to take a step back in time, explore nature, or marvel at world-class artwork by Monet, Degas, Cassatt, Manet, and Whistler. There is so much to discover only at Hillstead. Please visit hillstead.org.
And you're listening to Archaeology of Connecticut with our host, Dr. Brian Jones, and Mr. Scott Brady. And today we're talking about the most fascinating things ever. And Kaz is on the phone, and Dan is here. So let's continue.
All right, excellent. So, Dan, you were talking about how there were sort of improvements in the climate happening in this time. And again, the nerdy side is that there's something called the hypsothermal period, which is sort of a warming and drying phase. It even shows up in like the Greenland ice cores, and it's sort of it's a pretty large scale phenomenon. But one of the interesting things is that there does seem to be a change then. Well, one aspect of that, though, is a lot of our upland wetlands are probably drying out. So people are shifting away from those environments, maybe to more riverine systems. We see the increase in fishing, therefore. And undoubtedly a focus on the coastal resources that we know nothing about, because those sites are now underwater because of sea level changes. And that's something that's also important to bear in mind. But following that period, say 6,500 to roughly 5,500 years ago, there's a weird, we'd call it a hiatus. That is a break in the archaeological record. I personally, I don't think I've ever excavated a site that dates into that 1,000-year time period, though I've seen a lot of these earlier sites. So Dan, or Kaz too, let's let Dan jump in first on that kind of hiatus question. What do you think might be going on?
I think this is one of the great puzzles in not just Connecticut archaeology, but certainly for southern New England and the Northeast. I think it looks more extreme in Connecticut for reasons that are hard to explain. There are sites that date to this interval in Massachusetts, some in Rhode Island, certainly in New York as well. The materials that are fall in this period are what look kind of like a hodgepodge. They're not easy to associate with what came immediately before or immediately after. In many cases, that's potentially due to us associating radiocarbon dates or features with the wrong tools. It can be very tricky to be confident that, the radiocarbon dates are actually associated with the tools that we think they are. Mm-hmm. So that may be part of it, but I think this is also probably the most neglected period in all of the pre-contact period for Connecticut. It rarely shows up on anybody's radar screen. We almost never talk about it. You can say there's not much to talk about, but we gloss over 1,000 years. Yep. Fairly easily in our summaries without reflecting the fact that something seems to have changed quite dramatically.
Presumably somebody was here because people don't just disappear.
Right. Somebody had to be.
Right. Cos, now, have you had sites dating in that rough, basically end of the Middle Archaic, beginning of the Late Archaic?
Yeah, just recently, bone from a rock shelter in Woodbridge came back about 5,800 years old.
Yeah, that's falling into that.
Interestingly, excuse me?
That's falling into that range. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Interestingly, what was found there was a Neville plain, which is usually, and some later stuff, which is usually, Middle Archaic. But, I think one of the questions there is a lot of times, like, for instance, in the early Archaic, we see point styles that develop outside the region, and then they come and go from their core area, but they hang on later in their peripheral areas. So maybe some of the question is, are some of these things that we interpret as Middle Archaic actually falling into the beginning part of the Late Archaic?
Yeah,
something like that could be happening.
Yeah. I have also excavated a feature that was dated to about 5,500 years ago that had a point in it that was very, very Neville-like. It wasn't a perfect match, but there is something to be said to that fact that particular tradition just extended a little longer here in Connecticut than others. Or, alternatively, we also get a diversification of styles. People in Connecticut just decided to do their own thing, like Yankees sometimes do. So, Scott, do you have any thoughts on this, now that you've been listening?
Yeah. I guess one of the questions is there any climate change during that 1,000-year period that's been identified? Is there something that would have prevented people from staying here or made other areas more attractive?
There's no major change in the environmental conditions for that particular period that I'm aware of. Certainly not one that would help explain this. And I think my gut reaction is this is much more likely to be a recognition issue. It gets complicated, though, because we have literally thousands of radiocarbon dates just for Connecticut. And when you add all of the dates that have been run from the surrounding states, this still looks like there are far fewer dates than we would expect that fall from this period. There have been some suggestions. Certainly Diana Doucette from Anasnappet Pond itself has a whole series of triangular projectile points that could easily be confused with late archaic tools that we'll be talking about very shortly. Those are one candidates. We may have been finding sites from this period, from this interval, for a very long time and just have not been able to recognize or associate those tools. That's a very common issue. In fact, the Middle Archaic in New England, as we know it today, is largely due to the publication of one site, the Neville site in Manchester, that became essentially the Rosetta Stone that allowed us to connect a whole series of sites that had been previously excavated, but nobody knew their age. So this one stratified site, this one very well-documented sequence was the key to sort of identifying this. And then it was a watershed. All of a sudden, Middle Archaic sites were recognized, sort of throughout the region, if not hundreds of them, certainly dozens, and eventually many more.
Right. It's a really important point to make, I think, because a lot of these narrow, tall, stemmed points were being called something else before, like 1976, when that was published, and often even associated with a much later time period, the Terminal Archaic. And I know this happened at certain places we've excavated where there was whole data sets of stuff being called the wrong thing. And it took later archaeologists in the 90s really going through it, and even into the 2000s, to reevaluate those artifacts and say, whoa, no, these date to like 8,000 years ago. They're not 3,500 years old. So that happens. We're not perfect. And we learn new things as we go. All right, so let's jump ahead into what's called often the Laurentian phase, the beginning of the late Archaic period. And Cos, why don't you've been doing a lot of work on the Laurentian and we'll discuss whether this is a subsequent phase or maybe something contemporaneous, the narrow stem or squibnocid phase. Do you want to talk about some of your experience dealing with those sites?
Yeah, actually, we get more in the narrow stemmed in the Central Valley, and in Western Connecticut, what sites I've worked on, Laurentian, it often seems to be lower in the stratigraphy. It seems to be older, and it also seems to be a little bit more sparser. And then that you get the narrow stem, the narrow point tradition, if that's what everybody's calling it. Above that, and it seems to be a lot more denser. You get an impression of an earlier Laurentian population that probably is a little bit thinner, but it's really hard to interpret.
Yeah, I agree. Dan?
Yeah, so just a couple of fairly recent excavations, in this case on Block Island. Jay Waller, one of my colleagues from the Public Archaeology Laboratory, excavated quite a large Laurentian site on Block Island. And what's striking about this is that the way we normally think of the Laurentian Archaic is as a very interior-focused population that lived in forests, particularly, again, lakes are the theme for me today, I guess. But Laurentian folks are often associated with large fishing camps on really large freshwater lakes, particularly to the north of us, right? So Lake Champlain, and then all the way up through the St. Lawrence Seaway and river. Those areas are what are often considered the sort of homelands for Laurentian populations. Finding them out on Block Island is a surprise in many respects. And there's been a decades-long debate about how to interpret these more sparse types of Laurentian tools that we find in Connecticut, very similar to what Cos was just mentioning. There are some exceptional Laurentian sites here in Connecticut, so some not very close to where we are here in the studio today that were excavated 30 years ago, where they're very large encampments, probably, people living for 6-8 months at a time, large numbers of people. Again, strong evidence for mortuary ceremonialism, for patterns that became very common in 1,000 years later that first show up clearly associated with Laurentian that had never been documented previously, and a whole range of tools that are very similar to what's been found in northern New England. So I think there's more than folks associated with this tradition just passing through New England, which was kind of a common interpretation for a long period of time. They are living here. They probably, in my estimation, came in from the north, down the Connecticut River Valley, and then from the valley spread east and west along the Long Island Sound for that. And they made it out to at least Martha's Vineyard, at least Block Island, and lived there for probably months at a time. We don't know if they were resident year-round there. That's yet to be determined, but certainly we're visiting outer coastal islands. So these are people who are very familiar with the landscapes that we know today.
Yeah. And so it's another case where archaeologists have debated whether the presence of a certain artifact type represents kind of movement of peoples associated with maybe a core homeland area somewhere outside of the region. And folks, some of our sort of greatest archaeologists of New England, like Dina Dinkhaus, sort of one of our grandmothers in archaeology in New England, had, if I remember this correctly, suggested that we don't have a proper Laurentian here in southern New England because we were missing certain elements of the toolkit. And to me, I always found that argument as a student, of the 90s, a little bit weak because I felt that site types we wouldn't expect some of those more elaborate, like the groundstone tools and the other aspects of that tradition that would show up. And we should add that this is an important time. We see really elaborate groundstone adzes and axes and to these technologies developing, showing a real focus on woodworking technologies. And it's not that didn't exist earlier, but this really kind of explodes at this time and is really some remarkable craftsmanship happening. So instead, I felt like the sites that we would find just tended to be smaller hunting camps in the upland areas, and we didn't have the same settings like on the Mohawk River, say, or where some of these sites or Lake Champlain were really big and elaborate.
It's interesting. I do think that there are really strong affinities, and there's likely very strong cultural connections. And I think the origins for that Laurentian Archaic, as I said, I do believe Ritchie was probably correct, in his early interpretations that this was a northern-based population, and we are more peripheral to that. But if you look around that greater periphery, and it's really around the St. Lawrence River Valley, when you head downriver, right, you get to what we often associate with folks who were part of the Maritime Archaic, which looks an awful lot like the Laurentian Archaic. There's more fishing. There's obviously more exploitation of marine mammals. There's sword fishing going on. These are people who are deep-sea fishers. They have specialized toolkits. But that said, there's an awful lot of similarities between what they're doing and what the folks in inland areas are doing, and there's clearly a lot of interaction between those populations. That carries through all the way into the Great Lakes, southern Ontario. Southeastern Ontario looks very Laurentian in some areas. Southwestern Ontario starts looking a little bit different. You see some of the same tools, you see some of the same projectile points show up, but they're associated with a whole lot of different suite of materials that don't show up in the sort of homeland. So I think there are definitely connections, but I understand the basis of that argument about whether or not what we have here is classic Laurentian or true Laurentian. It always seems like a slight derivation or slight variation that we see in these areas.
Yeah, and it does become kind of an academic question. And what is clear is that there are people here pursuing a very similar sort of cultural tradition. And we do see, though, a fairly abrupt change to, and I would add the Laurentian folks that the sites we've worked on tend to have a preference for fairly high-quality raw materials. Chert is more common, I feel, at many of these sites. Not that quartzites are being ignored, but there is a tendency not to use too much quartz. But we see a major, major shift with the narrow stem tradition. So, Cos, this gets us back to your work because you focused largely on these narrow stem sites. So why don't you tell us what those camps look like?
Well, they apparently in the Woodbridge Valley during the fall-winter period, they would come inland to the well-sheltered river valleys, and they seem to have constructed pit houses. The pit houses were shallow, but they seem to have been used for a long period of time because you can see trash middens banked against the outside, and where we piece plotted things, you can almost see an image of the outside of the structure. And they seem to be recurrently using the same parts of the landscape, which kind of shows that they're becoming somewhat territorial in the sense that they're reusing the same river valley, the same fall-winter sites, or at least the same areas again and again and again. And probably that's associated with the fact that there's getting to be a larger population. Mm-hmm. So as hunter-gatherers, we expect, anthropologically, them to be living in bands, being what we call band-level societies. And I think one of the things about interpreting the late Archaic is how we interpret this word band. But a band would basically exploit a particular territory. So hunter-gatherers always kind of live at low population densities because they have to have sites, say, on the summer along the coastline, and inland at fishing sites, inland at hunting sites. So you have a small group of people that's exploiting a territory. So when we think about high population density of these types of hunter-gatherers, these types of band territories are getting packed into the landscape. People are living closer together. And I think a lot during the late Archaic, we see things like usage of local raw material, very simple tools. And a lot of times we look at that and see as kind of evidence of kind of isolation of these cultures. But in a lot of ways, these same things can be interpreted differently. Because if we think ethnographically of bands, if we think more of not our way of thinking of a social unit, but the way people in the past thought of a social unit, these bands would be pretty much ecological containers. But within those areas, you'd have a group of people that would exchange membership between local bands. We would call that inter-band flexibility. In other words, there's a lot of interaction and exchange, people moving from one band to another. So if that's happening, then people are spending a lot more time engaged in these kind of social, political activities with other bands. So, it makes sense that they're using kind of local raw materials, making simple tools, and doing a lot of things to kind of save time, like hunter-gatherers do, because they're probably engaged more in kind of interactions, social interactions between band members of different territories. At least that's how the archaeological record looked like to me.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, and so we're seeing maybe more of an investment in what we might call the social economy rather than just sort of the food economy or something.
Yeah, people are spending less time making tools. They're hunting more efficiently. They're moving kind of in very kind of logical ways where they're staying put for a time, and the reasons hunter-gatherers normally do these things is to kind of minimize the time they're spending working. And hunter-gatherers, tend to be ethnographically very social people. So we could expect that as the landscape fills up, that this is affecting the way they're organizing their lives. So they're spending more time, with nurturing these kind of alliances, building political relations, and of necessity, resolving disputes about, adjacent territories and things like that. So, yeah, that's kind of the way, that's the way I kind of interpret the technology and the different decisions that people were making, at least in the Central Valley in Connecticut.
Yeah. Dan, would you add anything to that?
No, I think what the point Cos is making is really important to having a reasonable picture of what this narrow stem archaic or small stem archaic looks like. So we talked about how common different sites from different periods. Narrow stem or small stem sites are everywhere. As an archaeologist, there's a common joke about you always find more narrow stems than anything else because it's the law, right? So Bob Goodby has made that joke. I love it. It feels true. You ask any field crew who's worked in the region, you find these sites with great frequency.
And I'm going to jump in because I think what you once said to me is, you just have to throw your hat and dig, and you'll find a narrow stem point.
They're ubiquitous, and this is all sites are not everywhere. But when you survey, when you're spending weeks on end digging test pits, you get a very keen sense for what you find frequently. And these sites are extremely common. And it's not just that they're common. A huge number of them date to a pretty narrow period of time, right? So we're talking about a roughly 800-year span where suddenly sites are showing up everywhere in the state. And there are entire parts of the landscape where sites are exceptionally rare other than for this period. And sometimes at the very end, shortly before Europeans arrived, the late woodland period, we start seeing another uptick. And so if you look at the frequency of radiocarbon dates, if you imagine them as a random sample, which they really aren't, but there probably is some relationship to the total number of dates that we have to the populations or number of sites on the landscape. And from that perspective, the late Archaic is like Mount Everest on this curve for it. So something is going on. And I think what Cos is mentioning is, I think, one of the great sort of puzzles here is that we have people that seem to be confined in many respects to small parts of the landscape, to territories. Is a very common framing for the late Archaic, for the small stem or narrow stem late Archaic. And yet people from watershed to watershed, or what we think of as region to region, seem to be living in remarkably similar ways. So there's this broad swath of the eastern seaboard where people are doing very similar things, and in many areas they're using the same raw materials. There's suddenly a shift towards quartz, and that extends down the eastern seaboard in many respects. It's not the only stone. In some areas, like in Rhode Island, they're using argillite, which is from the Narragansett Bay. It's a very localized material. So it is local in flavor, but quartz is pretty common material all up and down the eastern seaboard where there's crystalline bedrock.
Yeah, and I think that question about why quartz at this time is worth kind of branching off into a little bit, because it's been sometimes referred to as sort of an intractable raw material to use. quartz is not born equal. There's really very glassy quartz that are great to work, and then there's very sort of sugary, crumbly stuff that you can't make a tool out of at all. But folks seemed very good at finding quartz, and we should say at this time, they seem very focused. The technology is focused on the sort of harvesting quartz pebbles that have been rounded in streams, and had very effective ways of sort of splitting those small pebbles or cobbles and then manufacturing a tool out of them, probably very, very quickly. So we even see it's a very classic sort of sometimes I get the German in my head. It's so funny. All these years, Merkmal. It's a classic component of these little points is that at the base, there's a little bit of that rind on the cortex left over, as if it's just almost left on purpose. It's, sometimes taken off, but it's a reminder of where that raw material came from. So we see a real force on sort of stream cobble raw materials. So, Dan, do you have any thoughts, or Cos too? I'll let you guys both kind of fight over who goes first there.
All you, Cos.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, quartz makes sense if what you're trying to do is you're trying to make tools really quickly that do the job. But if you're really trying to do that with minimizing the time you're spending, it's easy to find. You don't have to go to some distant quarry. So, we often think, I think in the late Archaic, we tend to think, well, they use quartz. Maybe they don't have access to other things. But I think it's unlikely that late Archaic people didn't have access to other things. I think, the other way to look at it is it's easy to find. You make tools very quickly. The best tool in the whole world is knock a flake off and use its sharp edge. And, at least, the sites I've looked at, there's a lot of expedient tools. There's a lot of tools that are made quickly that way. If your lifestyle involves trying to make a living and then, having some time to go visit friends and neighbors that live not far away, maybe it's not such a bad choice.
Right, and at the same time, we see the continuation of the tradition of these very elaborate groundstone tools. So it's not like they're not spending time sometimes making really beautiful tools, but these little, I think, Dan, you're the one who's described these narrow stem points as sort of disposables. They were like the Bic lighter of the late Archaic period. You just chucked them out after use.
And I think part of that, too, if you look at these projectile points, there's an awful lot of stone tools, which we casually call projectile points. Many of them were very likely used as knives. Mm-hmm. And they're not exclusive categories. Things were used as both projectile points and as knives. They were hafted to foreshafts, so they could be readily handled that way. Narrow stems, probably not. These are pretty blunt tools that are mostly made for poking holes in something. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so they don't likely have the same range of uses. They're not as adaptable for that. And so when they break, they're quickly replaced. Again, as we keep talking about, this raw material for making these are relatively common. So you're rarely out of sorts if you break your narrow stem.
Right. And we should say it probably took, for a skilled craftsman, 5 minutes to put one together. Yeah. Right. So I think this brings up another point, and we'll go back to this question of population density and potentially what these points are used for, is as much sociality as we see, social living and exchange of individuals between groups and communities. It certainly raises the question with increased population whether or not we may have evidence of violence as well, because when people are starting to compete over resources, you can expect some violent interchanges to happen. So let's go to Dan first. Any thoughts on that? There's some kinds of evidence out there.
Sure. There's somewhat limited evidence in Connecticut. Really, this is largely an effect of preservation. Human bone, like any other animal bone, does not survive terribly long in our acidic soils here, but in surrounding regions, particularly in New York, there's extensive evidence of interpersonal violence during the late Archaic period. And in many cases, in a number of cases, that seems to be between what we call Laurentian Archaic populations and those associated with Lamonca Lake, which is essentially the New York tradition associated with small stems and narrow stems. So these are larger scale conflicts in some cases. But even among populations, there's a lot of projectile points embedded in bones. There are a number of cases in coastal Connecticut from shellmans Also, where there's clearly been a violent end to an individual who's found essentially in a trash area in a site. And so this was not necessarily comfortable sharing of the landscape as populations were increasing in all areas. How endemic that was, we don't know, but there does seem, it's hard to parse whether what we're seeing is really just because these sites are so much more common, we're seeing rare events more frequently, or whether there, which I think is more likely, that there really is a rising level of violence, both intercommunal and interpersonal, during this particular period.
Yeah. Cos, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, because if we're talking about the increased social interaction, there's always reasons why, you have to have increased interactions. You have to spend more time making alliances, and usually, the functional reason is to resolve disputes, but that takes for granted the fact that you have disputes. So kind of the idea that you're getting more of a kind of a network between kind of local band, territories kind of would pretty much predispose the fact that one of the reasons you're doing that is because there's increased, conflict.
Yeah. So let's also think about what these communities actually looked like on the ground. Because I have a very strong sneaking suspicion that we've been underestimating their complexity, to the point that, in my mind, I've often, wondered to myself whether or not we should be expecting something that looked more like large-scale kind of horticultural communities with, maybe even longhouses or fairly complex architecture associated in almost a large-scale, if not annual setting, than one that's maybe used seasonally. And my example that I pull from my head is usually the Yanomama, which people may not be that familiar with, but that's a South American horticultural group. That is, they're growing some crops and doing a lot of hunting. But they're very involved in inter-community kind of warfare. 40% of the men in these communities die through violent acts. And we have some weird sites out there, like, I guess, Wapanukit comes to mind, where there seem to be these very peculiar, elaborate, large-scale structures going on. And when I think of other sites that we've excavated, like at Preston Plains, there seem to be a series of these large pit houses. And those have been interpreted somewhat differently by another one of our colleagues, Tim Ives. But some of the ones I excavated certainly had hearths at the bottom of them. He had suggested some of these may just be natural tree throws, pits caused by trees falling over. But it looked like to me, in the areas I dug, we dug in somewhat different areas of the same site. My conclusions were a little different. I felt like there was a repeated use of this landscape by a fairly substantial community. And it made me really start to appreciate the complexity of their social world and kind of their architectural world potentially here too. And Dan, you and I also excavated a pit house site. That was also Preston, I think,
Preston,
right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to share what you remember on that one?
No. So I think not fully being aware of what Cos has been working on recently in Western Connecticut with the pit houses. In the Thames River Valley, the ones we've documented are excavated perhaps 75, 80 centimeters below the surface, may have been a little bit deeper from the original ground surface. Not a huge number of features within these pit houses, but hearths, clearly burned soil, wood charcoal, and a whole lot of narrow stems and quartz debris associated with them. They're probably more common. It's ironic. These types of features are actually very hard to find in our typical test pit surveys. The scale of the feature is so much larger than the test pit you're digging. It can be surprisingly difficult to put your finger on what it is you're looking at. So we often joke that small features are impossible to find in test pits. It's a needle in a haystack issue. Well, the big features are in some ways even more complicated because the scale of your test relative to the phenomenon you're trying to find is completely off on that. So I do think that we're probably under-identifying these types of things. The other thing I would say is Wapanukit in eastern Massachusetts is a remarkable site, in many ways unique, and that's what makes it very difficult to generalize from. And there are some very unusual architectural features at Wapanukit. It's hard to know whether they're actually associated with the late Archaic. I think many of them very likely are, but there are more recently documented early Archaic components there that look an awful lot like a number of sites that we talked about a little bit last episode. So it's hard to be confident what that housing would have looked like. I think pit houses were likely one mode of housing, but I suspect much of the year these people during this period were likely living in pole-framed weetus, wigwam-type structures. I would agree with you, Brian, that there likely are larger season-long habitations, particularly on levees and knolls on the major river valleys, and probably in some of the upland areas in more favorable locations. There probably are substantial, if not villages, there are, substantial months-long occupations for 50 to 200 people.
Yeah, and Scott, I think in the beginning you had mentioned that word kind of village, and it's important to say that we really don't have anything like that. I mean, you could argue some of these early Archaic sites, something village-like is kind of happening, at least seasonally. But it's until the late Archaic, again, that question comes up. Should we call it a village or not a village? Even much later in time, people argue whether we should call a thing a village or not. But there is this sense that there are these, at least communal gatherings that last a pretty long time, suggesting a lot of people are living on the landscape. And again, there's a lot to manage there. There's conflict resolutions and things like that. Scott, what are your thoughts listening to some of this now?
I guess I'm trying to put together in my head, how big is a pit house? What's the size of the group of people? Would they be family? Would it be an extended family?
Right. So one of the interesting things about houses, and this is throughout indigenous North America, right? So we're acclimated to certain housing space here, and so people are often shocked at how many people lived in some of these smaller houses. So the size pit houses that I'm familiar with that are very likely early Archaic, the large end of the spectrum would be about 5 meters in diameter and circular. Some of them are more likely, there's a modal size that's probably around 4 meters wide and 6 meters long, so kind of oval shaped for it. But there might have been 12 people, 8 to 12 people, so more likely an extended family, grandparents, young children sharing that space. We don't know the full range, and there probably were larger structures, some of them used for ceremonial purposes or for feasting, but most likely the domiciles, the actual habitation areas are in that size range.
So it's something probably smaller than your typical living room.
Yeah.
And you've got many people, even maybe more than a dozen living in there. But I think the idea is that you've got your extended family group in one of these, and there may be a couple on the landscape adjacent to one another. Though, like at this late Archaic site we were examining, I think we only ever found the one. But I agree, they are very hard to identify in the field. Cos, did you have? We're getting close. I think about 3 minutes left, maybe. Any additional thoughts on housing and general sort of life ways and what the day-to-day life looked like?
It's important to think of the fact that we need to get rid of our own kind of notions of housing and what it's supposed to look like, because realistically, you can have a large group of people that have fairly simple structures living together. So, in the past, notions about how people should live together in large groups might have been, different. There might have been, less investment in building big structures and things like that we see archaeologically, but that doesn't mean that, big populations didn't live together. It'd just be harder to recognize archaeologically.
And here, there was one more point I think we wanted to get in before we close today, and that was this idea of these gendered toolkits. And Dan had recently given a paper on this, and it's something that I ran into potentially on a recent site we did in Rocky Hill. So, Dan, do you want to just, in our last minute or so?
Sure. I'll quickly say that my analysis is completely inspired by another colleague, Ora Elquest, who has been investigating what look to be women's encampments, and in particular looking at the recycling of tools. In other words, objects that were likely picked up and repurposed for specific tasks, a whole series of informal tools, and those informal tools associated with fairly large pottery assemblages. I don't mean large in the grand sense, but much more than you would expect in the small, for these small site locations. So Pal did some excavations again on Block Island and found another one of these sites near a small wetland. The pottery has residues from grasses that were very likely boiled. In this area, the wetland itself would have contained a whole series of edible and exploitable plants that were probably one of the foci for the women who we believe were living there. And it's speculative, and there's lots of ways to critique this, but I think, especially on Block Island, I'm intrigued by the idea that living on an island, there may have been much greater latitude for certain segments of the population to move around the landscape that may not have always been available for people living in the mainland, where people are packed together and you're not necessarily friendly with your neighbors. So I think we still have an awful lot to flesh out about our understanding for both the Middle and the Late Archaic.
Yeah, and we should just to note there that I think her sites were ceramic period in age.
Those were, yeah.
And had you worked on that, was pre-ceramic though?
So there's both late Archaic and late woodland components for the.
Yeah, so we should just make sure it's clear to people that the Middle and Late Archaic period we're talking about really lacked ceramic technologies. There was really no pottery. Just to make sure we leave them with the right idea in their heads. And again, I had a site that was dated to about 3,000, we think about 3,400 or so years ago, that also had a lot of just really straightforward flake tools being created and left on the site, and a real lack of the hunting stuff that you typically see on these sites. And so one interpretation when we see that is this is maybe a sort of a women's-oriented camp where they're doing certain kinds of food processing that required those tools, and very likely making those tools themselves. So are we getting pretty close to time here?
We've got a few seconds.
Okay, so let me just say that we will next month talk about the Terminal Archaic period. I like to think of this as a time where we may see some efforts, elaborate kind of ritualized efforts being made to mitigate some of this inter-community violence that may be going on during the period we just talked about. And we're going to talk, hopefully, about stone bowl technology and the development slowly towards the development of a ceramic tradition. So with that, we'll close out for today. I want to thank all you guys for listening. And Dan, thanks for being here, and Cos, and Scott, of course.